Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. One of the core ideas that I've tried to explore on this podcast about the North American West is place. Where is the West, or plurality of Wests? What do they look like, and how do they operate? Where do Westerners situate themselves in those places, and how is their sense of identity shaped by them? One way I had yet to consider in addressing these questions was that of leaving or returning to a place. How do we think about Western homes differently when we leave? And how does our outside experience inform relationships with Western homes when we return? Today we chew on this a bit with Corinna Cook, whose intimate collection, Leavetakings, published by the University of Alaska Press in 2020, shares experiences that, at least for me, resonated very much with my Western identity in new and unexpected ways. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, allow me to take a moment to explain a bit about Writing Westward and myself. Each episode features a conversation with people writing about the North American West: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. By showcasing their work, I hope to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who call it home. If a writer or topic intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all tasks for which I have no training. But I am passionate about the North American West, so this difficult work is well worth the excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people. At the end of each episode, I'll include a little bit more information about me and my scholarship, and about the Redd Center, our public programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. With that, let me introduce a little bit more about today's guest and why we're talking to them. Corinna Cook is a former Fulbright Fellow, an Alaska Literary Award recipient, and a Rasmussen Foundation awardee. She holds a PhD in English and Creative Writing from the University of Missouri, and currently lives in Alaska, where she teaches, writes, hikes, explores, and has adventures. In her collection of essays, Leavetakings, published by the University of Alaska Press in 2020, she shares stories about her comings and goings from her home in Alaska. She writes of her childhood, of the present, and of the many years between, of Alaskan mountains and seas, of wildlife and heavy industry, of living with a set of relationships to a place, and of how those inform relationships with death and dying in the same. While some of the Alaskan landscapes and realities of living in them may seem unfamiliar to some Westerners, there's much here that will speak to anyone who has spent any time outside of suburban sprawl, pondering one's place in broader Western landscapes and environments. I, for one, will bring new eyes and ears to my next outdoor adventures, having sat with Cook's essays. I will also think about home differently the next time I visit. I suspect others who read Leavetakings will do the same. Corinna Cook, welcome to Writing Westward.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Can you let us know where you're recording from?
Yeah, I'm calling in from Tlingit. I'm in Southeast Alaska. I was born and raised here on the traditional territories of the Occoquan Tlingit and Takuquan Tlingit in Juneau.
Great. I don't know if this is the farthest guest. No, I did have a guest call from Finland, so that was probably the farthest. But well, I'm really happy to have you, and I'm really excited to take our podcast back up to the far, far northwest. We did an episode with Bathsheba DeMuth about the Bering Strait, so we've touched a little bit on Alaska, but your essays bring us, if Alaska's periphery, the Bering Strait was kind of the periphery of the periphery, so you kind of bring us back a little bit more to continental territories. And I'm really excited to do that. I like pushing the boundaries of how we think about the West. Your book is it's essays. They're poetic, they're reflective, and so it's hard to do an interview like I do with some where we just kind of work through the content of the book together and talk about stuff. Um, and so instead, I think I'm going to be pulling some broad ideas and questions that your essays brought to mind, and then we can chew on those together. So I want to start by thinking of having you kind of think out loud about the West and what it means. You don't pitch your essays as explicitly Western, but as I read them, it resonated with all of my very Western life experiences. So how do you think about yourself and your identity uh, in relationship to the West?
That's such an interesting question. I think often of the West, kind of academically in terms of Western civilization. And then when I think of the Western US, I guess I think of it as kind of like a grandfather. I think of the West as a place where a lot of experiments were run and a lot of discoveries were made, and Alaska is repeating many of those same experiments and repeating many of those same discoveries, but on occasion learning something from a discovery made in the West. For example, the West was heavily mined, right? The extractive economy in the West is pretty darn interesting. I spent some time a year writing, as an undergraduate, a year writing about the Pebble Mine debate in Alaska. And that entire conversation relies heavily on lessons learned from Montana. So I see the West as absolutely part of the lineage, although it doesn't occur to me every day to place myself on the map. I feel very included when a conversation about the West acknowledges and involves Alaska, because often it doesn't.
Yeah. So do you think yourself more of Alaskan as its own thing? But when invited to think about the West, you think, oh yeah, things kind of match up here and connect, but it's not how you think about yourself day by day.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I would introduce myself as, a thinker from the West. But I think we have a lot of common ground. And that's like an area that I could explore and grow into. But it's certainly, we're a long ways away from the deserts of the Southwest. It's really, really easy to go all week without, remembering that New Mexico exists, for example.
Yeah, you live in a strikingly different surroundings. Well, maybe just kind of help us try to situate Alaska and how we think about the broader North American West. We could use the introductory essay as a good starting point about this 4,000-mile road trip you take from where you did your graduate work in Missouri back up home to Alaska, and how you intentionally drove instead of flew. And you write because you wanted to, quote, look at the large ancient continent, and you wanted to look at the shape of it. So thinking about that road trip and other times, you traversed the lower 48 portions of what we would think of as the West. How do you situate some of those iconic Western landscapes, or the Great Plains, or the Mountain West, or the Desert Southwest, with your Alaskan homelands? Is Alaska just a variant of the West that us lower 48ers know, or is it something uniquely different? How do you situate it as you've driven across the whole thing?
I wish I could answer that question. I confess I know so little about how Westerners think about the West that I can't necessarily, I can't necessarily speak directly to how they think and how I think, because it's a major blind spot for me. I know that I'm very interested in imagining when I've crossed parts of the West. I've been very interested in imagining it let's a century ago, 2 centuries ago. I've been very interested in trying to see underneath the infrastructure that's on top of it right now. So I will identify this as a probably very specifically Alaskan perspective. It is incredibly built up. The West is truly incredibly built up. And there's parts of it that have so many roads. There's so many towns. They're so close together. There's so many people. There's parts of it that are parks, and there's rules in parks. And there's parts of it that are agricultural. And you think, oh, what was underneath that before it was agriculture? And so I think if I get anything from my Alaska perspective, looking at the West, I think I get a lot of really good hints about how much of it shows through the infrastructure that exists right now. I find it really fascinating. Kansas, for example, fascinates me. I don't even know if that counts as the West, but Kansas, for example, fascinates me because it is the shape of the land is so different than I come from fjord country. Mountains come up out of the ocean. I come from an archipelago. There's a lot of islands. I find it amazing to think about standing somewhere in Kansas and finding your way someplace, like walking to a place that is there and getting there and then turning around and walking back. I find that incredible. And I spend so much of my life and time in Alaska, learning landmarks, remembering landmarks, don't drop off the mountain in that direction. They're not going to find the trail. That's going to be a cliff system. And I look at Kansas and I think, this is incredible. I can't see anything. But this place has been, people have lived there for millennia who can see things. Anyway, so I think that's what the situation does for my thinking.
Yeah, like when I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, my wife grew up in the Phoenix Valley. And so we grew up in places where there's lots of visual landmarks, right? Like, oh, mountains that way, ocean that way, or, and then we lived in Nebraska for a decade and it really weirded my wife out. She said it made her feel exposed and vulnerable just because the landscape it was just so big and there was no visual markers to help her situate herself, where she is. But it's interesting you say, like, in Kansas, though, like there's a freedom like that you can just walk in a direction. I guess there'd be fences and stuff, but this idea that you don't have to be as concerned about the danger of the landscape and looking at which route am I going to take to get around and over obstacles. It's just wide open.
Yeah, and it actually is really reminiscent of the Arctic, which is, this vast area of Alaska and Canada in which I have virtually no experience. It's a completely other universe, although at this time in history, there's, a great piece of the Arctic that's called, Alaska. Supposedly it's the same state that I'm from. But it's incredible to have family, friends who can speak about finding their way across what to me looks like undifferentiated sea ice and tundra based on information like the direction of the wind and the slightly different texture of the snow. If the dominant wind has been, kind of ruffling the snow in this way, then it's kind of like a compass point. I mean, there's phenomenal crossover in some ways between how I hear people from the high Arctic talking about moving around on the land in the Arctic, and then how I imagine one must do this in the plains.
Your experiences in Alaska, the way you write, indicated to me or seemed to suggest that Alaska features a style of living where so many of the modern conveniences that many of us don't even think about, but that we have that kind of buffer the harshness of the environment that insulate us from, the outside natural world. It seems that in Alaska, a lot of those things, at least in the stories you tell, have been stripped away, leaving you with a much more raw, direct, inescapable relationship with the natural world. Even if you're living in some of Alaska's cities, it seems that the immediacy of nature and the environment is more pronounced than I think it is for lower 48ers. I don't think lower 48ers is a term, but I'm going to use it.
Lower 48ers, incidentally, is definitely a term.
It is? Okay. All right. I've never referred to myself like that. Maybe it's a term for Alaskans.
We talk about outside, and that means the lower 48, and we talk about the lower 48.
Okay. What do you have to say about this? About, as you also lived in California and Missouri, and you've traveled around, some other places. How do you think Alaskans might think differently about the immediacy of nature and the environment, and danger and risk? And it seems you can't ignore it in ways that I can.
Well, my experience is that Californians and Missourians think very differently about this. I find it kind of anthropologically fascinating, the sort of academic experiences that I've spent down south, sort of studying people who are absolutely not paying attention to the things that we all are automatically always paying attention to. So that's absolutely a disconnect that I have observed and pondered deeply. I will say, for example, it is completely normal for us to have a sleeping bag in the car. One should have a sleeping bag in the car. That's basic. Why should one have a sleeping bag in the car? Because the car might break, the land might slide. Like, you don't know when and where you need to stay warm. In the part of Alaska in which I was born, and is one of the kind of the three areas that I live in at this time, it's a temperate coastal rainforest. It is just as easy to kind of mess up in the summer and become hypothermic, and actually have very serious problems. This is not just a winter thing that you would need to just make sure you don't get cold. You make dumb mistakes when you get cold. You just need to be prepared to don't get cold. You can get a little cold and you're fine, but things get weird when you get real cold. So of course you have a sleeping bag in the car. That's necessary. You have a shovel in the car for similar reasons. If you're cutting corners, like I will admit I sometimes do, then maybe I only have an Avi shovel in the car, a small portable avalanche shovel that backcountry skiers would carry in their backpacks. That is cutting corners. You should have a big solid grate. And, I don't know the last time you dug a car out of a snowbank, but it's nice. You want the right size shovel, So those are some of the just really normal kind of daily things. I don't think you necessarily see people walking around telling each other very profoundly, you have to respect the weather. That's just baked in. You respect the weather, it's going to change and it's going to throw challenges your way. And you want to make sure your kids can get off and on the school bus in a good way.
Yeah. Like you write that you grew up, like when you get off the school bus, you look both ways for wildlife, like, or when you step outside your door, that's just kind of a baked in habit, something that you don't even think about.
Yeah, and you should do that. Downtown Juneau is one of the places where you do see black bears. The first bear I ever saw, I was 3 years old. My dad had taken me to the bank. We came out of the bank and there was a mama with cubs in the street. And yeah, you look both ways for all of the traffic, whether it's on the street or on the trail or on the beach.
Again, it just strikes me that, we had a bear show up it actually walked right past our kids' elementary school and then got treed in one of the trees at City Hall, like in the middle of suburbia. But obviously this bear kind of wandered down at night into the suburbs and then out of the hills. And once it got light outside, it was a little climbed up a tree to hide, but generally uh, I don't have to worry about wildlife. Even when I go trail running and play in the mountains, I don't even think about it that much. It's not crawling with bears or moose, although we do have bears and moose, but just not quite as many.
I should, though, say that it's not only worry, it's also there's camaraderie, and there's a lot of different relationships. It's a deep set of relationships. And so you're partly looking for bears because they're beautiful and they teach you things about, where the food is at. It's always cool to see, like, how healthy is that animal? What does that tell me about last winter?
Tell
Anyway.
us the story about the otter. You and your dad are out looking out over the water, and you see, an aquatic mammal swimming and crying, and then and there's an eagle in this story as well. I think that maybe this is a good example about how wildlife interactions aren't all negative or something to be scared of, but how they teach you something about the landscape in which you live. Can you kind of briefly summarize that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important conversation for me also. I was very small. My dad took me on a walk in a place where we often walk. So many of my essays involve the North Douglas boat launch, incidentally, very, very central place for me. And there was a mama river otter, swaying back and forth, crying and shrieking. We didn't know immediately what was going on. We pieced it together. By we, I mean my dad. I was just there. Basically, an eagle came down. There's a lot of eagles in the zone. It's a lot. So an eagle came down, plucked at the water, got something. They often hunt or fish with no success. They're really good scavengers, and they're good hunters. But there's you come up dry a lot of the time. But this time it got something, and it flew away. It was too heavy. It landed in the ditch a ways down the road. And, and then it picked it back up and flew again. And we walked down there, and there's a lot of blood. And that was, so the next day there was this crying and shrieking. And so the way that we pieced it together, that my dad pieced it together, was that eagle fished this river otter's pup, and made a successful kill. It was a baby river otter, but there's a mother river otter on the other side of that, and she's mourning and grieving. And we went back several days in a row, and she was there, going back and forth, calling. And on one hand, this is so sad. This is so sad. There's nothing like a bereaved mother. I have a personal fixation on, the mothers of dead children. I'm very interested in this. And so this was one of them. And one of the conversations that my dad really opened at that time with me was that the eagle is a mother also. And that eagle was able to feed her babies. And that, in fact, she has to feed her babies. Like, she is being a really good mother. And that is how you be a really good mother. That's an ongoing zone of thinking and feeling and expression for me. We are all in these really deep relationships, and some of these relationships are absolutely consummated by, death. We rely on one another. We absolutely rely on the death of others to put life into our own bodies. And by we, I mean, the universe, plants, animals, fungi. I don't know if I can think this through with rocks and waterways, but we could go there in a poem at some point.
Yeah, this is where my kids would start singing The Lion King, the circle of life or something. As we've had these discussions, when we find, a half-eaten deer carcass or something on the trail, and oh, that's so sad. Or I'm like, it is, but that mountain lion had to eat too. Oh yeah, I guess that's right. And then they start singing the Circle of Life usually. No.
I want a version of the Circle of Life that just has more minor chords in it. I want the Circle of Life
a little more
done
somber.
by a real blues artist. Somebody with a sense of the gravitas involved in that circle.
Yeah. So maybe in Alaska, maybe you're faced with that more often or more regularly, or in a more consistent way, that it just becomes part of your awareness, that a lot of even Westerners, I mean, most Westerners live in suburban urban settings, even though we often think of the West as rural or unpopulated. Geographically, a lot of it is, but demographically, the population is the most urban and suburban population in the United States. But how do Alaskans think about outsiders coming in? That's something I'm curious about, which I saw around the edges of some of your essays. But as you're mostly focusing on very much of an insider perspective, I sometimes think about when I go to national parks, and I consider myself pretty outdoorsy. And sometimes I chuckle when I see people out on trails and they're decked out in just $5,000 worth of the fanciest outdoor gear that, I mean, I would love to be able to afford. And they look maybe they look the part. I don't know, maybe they don't. And I'm there and, whatever I'm wearing, but they're struggling to hike. They're struggling. So they're wearing the gear to be outside, but it's not who they are. Like they got kitted out for this expedition, to walk along a paved path in Yellowstone, and they're kitted out to a ridiculous degree, right? My kids are in flip-flops. And so sometimes I think about the insider outsider, or who belongs, who doesn't, who's kind of an imposter. How do Alaskans, so I mean, all of these stories you're telling, it's because you were raised there and you have a very different perspective. How do you guys think about when Americans come in from the lower 48, even ones who are really experienced in the outdoors? Are you suspicious of them? Do you roll your eyes at them? What's the relationship between the kind of insider outsider relationship between Alaskans and non-Alaskans who come to visit or come to live?
There's also a lot of insider outsider relationships within Alaska. And there are so many very different perspectives that are, Alaskan perspectives of outsiders. I can try to touch on a few. I certainly can't represent them all. But I think that a lot of us love these places, just love these places. And if an outsider shows up because they're interested and curious and like just open-hearted and into it, I mean, that's the kind of, in my circles really embrace that. If you are an independent traveler who figures out how to get a couple of ferry tickets and take a couple of airplanes and go around, I mean, that's extremely cool, right?
Because it took some effort to get there.
Yeah, it took some effort, and there's some independence there. Yeah. It's very difficult for me to say anything positive about the tourism industry as it has taken shape. The cruise industry is an ugly thing. That's where I'm coming from. I am not the only person who thinks that. There are other perspectives. Some people will argue that the cruise industry is important to Alaska's economy. Fine, I'm not an economist, but I think we know a great deal about how those multinational companies own so many of the little gift stores that their passengers are funneled into, as well as how many passengers never leave the ship. There's absolutely some negativity to Plum in that area, particularly because I'm from Southeast, and Southeast is a cruise ship destination. And yeah, my perspective is that that's one of the least rich, most impoverished ways of getting here, and kind of not being here, doing a floating hotel with Alaska around you. But that aside, I think what's really important about the question is also internal to Alaska. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human inhabitation here, and I'm from here, and that I was born here. My parents weren't born here, like my roots here are personally very deep. But when you think of me as a drop in the human current, like I'm just part of westward expansion and the stupendous land grab that makes America. And that's something to live with. That's not a weight that I carry, I guess, in like a simple way. And I think a lot of us have to find ways of on one hand, finding a degree of peace with the simple facts of our complicity in some histories that are really like brutal and that maybe discussed us personally, but created our reality, and we're active participants. I'm an active participant. There's absolutely some insider outsiderness to think about, quite locally, quite regionally, and historically. And I think I put much of my energy into trying to learn about and respect some of those histories, as opposed to really noticing that, like, oh yeah, for a couple months of the year, people from down south show up. Like that's cool too. Some of them fall in love and then come back and stay, and most of them don't. And I don't know. It's more on the periphery for me.
You also put a lot of energy into thinking about, it's not just tourism that is bringing outsiders or outside influences to the landscape, but lots of other industry as well. And when you talk about your experiences up at the Pebble Mine, or during your, I guess not cross-continental road trip going through mining and logging communities, up in the Rockies and the Cascades, the division for many of us between the natural world and extractive industries or infrastructure, I feel like down here it's often the lines are blurred a bit, things are softened a bit. But the way that you write about roads or mines, as scars across the land, it seems like the division between the natural world and human impacts or actions in that world are very stark. How did you feel, as you're making that road trip and seeing the remote, these remote mountain landscapes, but then cut and bisected by roads, by logging, by mining activities? How does it make you think about the landscape? Because I feel like that it's such a stark divide. And again, we're like, here, I live in the suburbs and I know that there's water infrastructure and roads and stuff, but it kind of just slowly blends up into the mountains. And I don't think about a hard line, not in the way that you write about it.
Well, I one thing that listeners should know, if you don't happen to have a map in your mind when you're crossing the continent and driving to Alaska, there's a lot of Canada that you go through. And if you're me, then you're not, you're avoiding interstates, and you're trying to avoid any urban place at all. So, and you're also, if you're me, you're never going to drive more than 6 hours in a day. So I think, making a 2-week traverse is always too fast. That's too fast. You can obviously do this, much faster, but but I think you should do. So you spend a number of days in the continental US, and then if you're wise about where you choose to cross the border from the US into Canada, really good place to do that is right around by Canada's Rockies, So then you get to spend a couple of days playing in the Rockies, in the Canada, and those are really great mountains, and it's a park. And so everyone, you get your park pass, and that's hilarious, but then you have a pass and you go in, and there's animals, and the animals all know they're living in a park. And so they're park animals. They're wild in some ways, but they're park animals. They're not hunted in the same. I know animals always know if they're in the park or out of the park, right? They behave differently on one side of the line than the other, and it's very visible. And then as you're going north, you get out of the park. And when you get out of the park, then you get into heavy industry. It might still be very, towns are very small and they're few and far between. It's wilderness, if you kind of accept that word in a different sense than it was in the park. And the logging trucks, the heavy machinery, the whatever kind of rigs one drives when one is part of oil drilling or mineral extraction, a lot of the the couple of other cars that are going to be on the road are, they're industry affiliates. They're on the job. They're working hard. They came from and love probably, someplace else. And they're going in and out of the woods to make money. They're cutting roads into the woods to access things that they can extract. These are, projects that are generally speaking funded by and run by major multinational corporations. So there's a lot of levels of planning and decision making. The local governments are, they're part of the regulatory processes, and a lot of those regulatory arms are very friendly with extractive resources. So there's a great deal of local debate and disagreement about who gets to run a road where. And anytime you put a road in, think of it as permanent. It turns out that once there's a road in, people use it. Anyway, so that's just an interesting thing that the road scientists, but the road experts tell us that once you put a road in, the road is not going to get reclaimed. The road is going to stay a road because the community will use it as such. And roads are really powerful. They dramatically change.
So many things follow.
So many things follow. And we have, plenty of data about what species will cross roads under what circumstances, what species will not cross roads under X circumstances. How frequent do the cars have to be before a deer will stop crossing the road is a very different answer than how frequent the cars have to be before a bear will stop crossing the road. There's again, I think coming out of places like Montana, there's fantastic information about these island populations of certain animals that will cross roads and the animals that will not cross the roads once they reach a certain threshold of use and busyness. It creates a really, really different system when you cut it up with roads. So how strange to drive through it and see it. It's very different to be a happy, dreamy hiker with my notebook in my backpack who just gets to go up mountains and be joyful. It's just very, very different to get on the road and see, oh my God, there's flames, they're burning off gases. Like they're doing climate change in front of me. I see it.
Yeah, I mean, like so much of this sounds to me like um, something that I would have read about 100 years ago, somewhere else in, let's say, the Mountain West. I mean, like Alaska is the last frontier. Do you think it holds that some of the much mythologized, you know, narratives of the Western frontier um, are still playing out just a few generations later in Alaska in ways that we're not experiencing quite as much down in the lower 48 of the West?
Yeah, it's a lot of the same stories that are playing out, simply, a couple generations later. And on occasion, there are some pretty interesting differences. Um, I go back to mining over and over. I realize, but there's been so many um eco disasters around mines in the West. So many, you know, so many. I don't think we have an example of a mine that hasn't had a substantial disaster associated with it. Um, and given that, that's really slowed down some of the permitting processes that occur in Alaska. Has it slowed down those processes enough? If you're me, you think no, absolutely not. But if you're much more pro extractive resources, and many Alaskans are, then there's a lot of frustration with how slow and ponderous the permitting processes have become. But I think that we owe some of those hoops. We owe them to federal legislation, which is always being dismantled in various. We owe this to federal modes of federal management, but we also owe this to some of the narratives that have come out of big mines, Utah, Montana, and there's been serious work from some Indigenous communities and some non-Indigenous communities to talk to Alaskan communities. And, there are groups of people that have been, flown down to see, a major mine down south, to simply help them
Here's what's
decide.
coming. Like,
right. It's
here's
like
warnings to think about. Here's
right. If you really want those jobs that you get with that pit, like we understand being on food stamps. We understand that you can't, but we understand economic hardship. But if you think the answer is to dig a pit, like we want to show you our pit before so there, I think that some of that really sense of, I'll call it like a larger Western community. I think that some of that has actually really, really helped Alaska.
interesting. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to think about water and the ocean a bit. As I was reading a lot of the way that you write about the ruggedness of Alaskan landscapes, it really resonated with a lot of my own experiences in the Mountain West and Desert Southwest. The ruggedness, the scale of nature, the immensity of it, the inability, therefore, to like ignore the natural around you because it's so big and so challenging. But what's unique about how you write about a lot of it is that your Western landscape in Alaska is tied also to seascapes and to the ocean, to salmon and otters and whales and tides, which for some coastal, Americans, it may be somewhat familiar, but I don't know, living on the Oregon or California or most of the Washington coast still sounds very different than the kind of coastal relationship that you're talking about. So and you have lived in California and you have been other places in the lower 48. So how does that just constant proximity, when you're in coastal Alaska, at least, to that proximity to the ocean kind of change, you think, your relationship with the broader landscape, or how is it informed by water in ways that say me here in Utah, I just wouldn't think about, even if all of your writing about the mountains and trails and all that resonates with my experience here in Utah. What's different for you there?
Well, I think that one of the things that I'm always thinking about as a writer is how do I use all of this, my incredible world? How do I use this as my most basic grammar? Like, so let's say my questions are largely philosophic, but I want to work them out in an actual laboratory, and my laboratory is, I'll call it the North, but it's like this part of the West in this context. And a major thing that I'm interested in, both, philosophically, aesthetically, is cyclic return cycles, the water cycle. Water rains down, goes in a creek, evaporates up, it makes a cloud, it rains down. That's cool. Some of the cycles that really are just central to my world as a Southeast Alaskan have very much to do with salmon coming back. This has a lot to do with my world, but this has also a lot to do with the world as it has basically always been, before any of the settler waves came to this place. This is a movement that really propels reality. Fishes, they spawn in freshwater creeks and streams. The little fishlets, depending on the species, will either live there for a brief time or potentially a little bit longer time. And then they go out into the ocean and they swim about and they live in the Pacific, and some of them go to Japan, and and depending on the species, again, maybe it'll come back in 3 years, maybe it'll come back in 5 years. But it comes back, it comes back home, and many of them spawn in their natal streams. And there's a lot of explorers too, this whole system is so dynamic. A landslide happens, a stream no longer exists. It's so rainforest, there's a lot of water coming down the watersheds, new creeks happen, so there's a lot of fish that explore. By fish, I mean different species of salmon, but so many of them go home and some of them explore, and this major wave of nutrients comes in every summer, and it's what the eagles are eating, it's what the bears are eating. The eagles,
historically, people, it's
what we're all eating too. I mean, yeah, like drop everything when you catch a white king, oh my goodness.
I mean, I've read studies where they've even tracked tracking the nutrients of dead salmon who often die after they spawn, tracking those nutrients as they but as they spread out into the surrounding, not bears and eagles, but plants and trees and,
absolutely,
and fungi. Like everything lives off that salmon.
You can track strong salmon runs in the rings of a tree.
Wow. We don't think about trees eating salmon, but
they do. They rely on it. We don't have a lot of soil here. It's just a little bit of really acidic soil sitting on top of bedrock. So their roots don't go deep. They go out laterally, and it matters what lands on the surface. That's a lot of nutrients.
So are you the salmon?
Am I?
I mean, because your book is about departures and about coming back home. It's a lot of it's about you coming and going.
Yeah, it is. And at the same time, I'm absolutely not a fish. A fish certainly belongs, and a fish is part of something larger that's happening. It's not clear to me that
that you are
right, that I play a role that's comparable in any way. I am very interested in arrivals and in departures and in continual returns. And I have many moments in this book that look at those questions on a pretty, personal level. But I think that really what's at stake in those questions is a a lot bigger than, a kind of drifting someone who moves about and moves again and moves again. I think we're coming back to, on a really big scale, we're coming back to some of the vegetation patterns that the paleontologists know things about. And as the north is warming, we're wondering if some of these kind of drier south facing slopes with grasses and so on, we're wondering, maybe what that ecosystem might spread again. That's the sort of ecosystem that we saw in the north during Beringian times, during the Ice Age, before there was a boreal forest in the north. There were grasslands, right? And we're kind of wondering, things are drying and warming again. We might be returning to those grasslands, to that time when there was a land bridge between Asia and North America. And so many animals, humans included, were walking back and forth across it.
So you definitely think in very cyclical patterns. I sense that, the way that you present time is very nonlinear.
I think that there is a bit of solace to be found there. There's a lot of reasons to be grieving right now. There's a lot of reasons to be grieving for settler colonial reasons. There's a lot of reasons to be grieving around climate. And, the world is transforming. Culture is transforming. Inherent in transformation is loss. That's complicated. That's complicated. But I don't know that grief is the only coherent response to loss. And I think that in cyclicality and some of these just larger big picture searches for a cycle, that there's a way to have a little bit of a sense of humor around what in the day-to-day absolutely registers as just clean, simple loss. I don't think it's clean, simple loss if you zoom out far enough.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you write at one point about as a young child, like 10 or 11, kayaking out into open water, out into, I think, Cross Sound, and having kind of a profound moment of finding your sense of self and where you situated in the universe around you. This really resonated with early experiences I had hiking and playing in the mountains and recognizing the larger natural world into which I fit, but very much land-based. And you had that epiphany. I have an 11-year-old. I'm imagining allowing my kid to kayak out into open water. That sounds bonkers. But you did, and you kind of found the sense of self, right? But again, tied there to the ocean. As you've left and then come back, when you return to that landscape and seascape that was formative for you finding a sense of self, do you find when you return that you think about it differently than you did when you had left? And then again, on repeated leavings and returnings, how does your relationship with that land and your sense of self in that landscape or seascape, how does it change and evolve?
It's very surprising to me every time I come back how completely normal it is. I have been told, once you leave the village, you can never go home. And I deeply believe that. I deeply experience that. And at the same time, every time I return, it's so awesomely normal. It's just so automatically, completely normal. And I think that is more surprising to me than anything else, is how it's just fundamental. It's just that's my background. That's where I come from. These are my basics. I don't necessarily always realize when I'm away how much effort I'm putting into just contending with something that's not normal, and the level of ease that I feel when suddenly normal things are normal again. So I think that's part one of the answer. And part two is that my thinking is really influenced by some of the academic study years that I've spent learning about social patterns, and about some histories behind some social patterns, and about politics, and about some of the ways in which power moves. And so when I first read Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and then came home, and it was so wonderfully normal. But what was different was that I could see how this profound sense of self that I had from exactly those trails and exactly those beaches was like, oh man, that depended so much on some really simple facts, such as that my parents had the means to get me a raincoat. Every time I outgrew a raincoat, they got me another raincoat. You can't go play outside in this weather without a raincoat, and you have to have boots that fit, and you can't go on the land if you don't have clothes for it. And so I think that what changes for me with every return is not at all my relationship to the place, which is just in some ways just like this even center line. Everything just revolves around it. It's invisible and lovely, but what really changes for me is every time I get an insight into how others have not necessarily lived on this land in the same way that I did and do and ideally will. I think that's where my lines of sight have really multiplied and continue to multiply.
That's fascinating. I like thinking about place and belonging a lot. And so the way that you write about place and belonging, but in the context of leaving and then coming back, I find that really powerful. And it's something that I want to think about more as I think about where I grew up and where I live now. I feel like I need to be a little bit more, I need more intentionality in being cognizant of how I look at things differently, or what new insights I might have about place when I come back. I grew up on the Canadian border, north of Seattle, and I like to go back I would love to go back every summer, because summer in the Pacific Northwest is pretty hard to beat. But every time I go back, the place looks different. It's growing, and but I'm also a very different person, and I do see that I whereas back then I maybe would have, as a kid, like, oh man, they built a new little housing development up on the trails that I used to mountain bike on, and now there's houses there. Actually, when I was a kid, this mountain that I used to mountain bike a lot on was actually owned by a logging company. And every once in a while, but they allowed us to bike on it, and every once in a while they would go and they'd do a big new clear cut, and all of our trails would be gone, and we'd have to like throw our bikes over our shoulder and walk along these logs to try to find, well, how do we get through this clearing, and where does the trail start again? And that really bothered me. But now I come back and I look at that, and maybe it still bothers me, but I have this very different understanding of logging and economies and development and all those things. And so your writings make me want to be more acutely, intentionally aware of what I'm bringing back home differently than when I had last left it.
Well, I would hope that that ideally that is something that comes out of this book, is a little bit of a sense that home is deep, and home doesn't give you all of its layers. It does. It's got something to say to you, but it's not telling you the whole story, and it's not going to tell you the whole story. But the more you get the story from elsewhere and come back, then home will tell you something new. If you're lucky.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good thought to end on. We're kind of at the end of our time, but yeah, I really appreciate it. It makes me want to read less dense history and more, you know, uh, more kind of reflective prose. I find it makes me want to write more of this as well. I was joking with my wife that I started writing out some questions that I wanted to ask and realized that I had started writing in this very kind of poetic, flowery language. And I'm like, I can't ask a question, but it's because that's how you were writing. And so my brain is kind of in that mode. I'm like, that's going to sound ridiculous if I say this question out loud like that in this, super flowery language. Anyway,
there's a glorious move in academia away from some of the really dense academic writing voices toward some of the more creative forms that we glean from literature, and that we can't, you can't make every argument in technical language. There are some arguments that resist technical language. There are some arguments that demand scene. So there's quite a bit that literature absolutely has to offer.
We're not trained very well in doing that. And there's very few of us, at least as historians, that, I mean, to bring her up again, Bathsheba Demuth's, her writing is hard-hitting history, but so poetic and evocative and lyrical, and it just makes me so mad. I'm like, it's not fair that some people are good historians and these amazingly beautiful writers. That's just not fair. They get to do both. But
she's got a really fantastic grasp of narrative structure, and she understands with great nuance the value of beginning, middle, and end. Yeah. And she knows how to use beginning, middle, and end as a serious tool, much more so than I do. I work much more associatively. There are absolutely, things that I too can learn from Bathsheba about constructing literature.
Well, maybe it's something that comes with spending a lot of time outdoors, because from her background, it sounds like she did, and it sounds like you did as well. So maybe there's something to be said there. Thanks for spending some time with us. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to keep you on my radar as you publish pieces. I know you publish in a lot of different venues, but in book form as well.
I really appreciate the conversation, and thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks so much, Corinna.
Mm-hmm.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We're an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understandings about the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah Dahl Dahl Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. Recently, my book, Native But Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. In an anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press in 2019, won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital history, public history project named Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to BW Rensink, that's RENSINK, brendanw.org or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind. Cheers.